Watch this video, make sure to read the prologue and chapter 1 in Humankind. So go do that first and then watch this video if you haven't already. So the first thing I want you to think about and ask about anything that I assign to you to read or to listen to or to watch, the very first thing you should always ask yourself is, who wrote this? Or who made this? Because that's really critical to understanding what you should think about the thing that they wrote or made or filmed, whatever it is. So with this book in particular, there's some questions you should be asking yourself about what the qualifications of the author are. So with absolutely anything, ask, who is this person? What kinds of qualifications do they have? What sort of background do they have that would make them either an expert or not an expert? And potentially, what are some of the things I should know about them that can help me judge to what extent they are biased in any particular direction, as that can then inform the way that I interpret what it is they have to offer for me. So, who wrote this book? Humankind. The author, of course, the name is there on the front of the book, Rutger Bregman. But for everything you do, you should actually do a little bit of online research and dig into who they are. So Rutger Bregman has a master's degree in history, but a master's is not a PhD. So on the scale of expertise, he is not a top academic, scholarly expert in his topic. So you might ask, we are here in an academic institution, in the university, so why would my professor, who does have a PhD and is therefore an expert in her field, why would she assign us in this class to read something from somebody who's not the top tier expert? And the answer, of course, well, not of course, but the answer from my perspective is that oftentimes the experts can write things in ways that make them very difficult to understand and to digest. And since this is an introductory course, then I want you to be able to understand and digest as much of the information as possible. So the next book that we're going to read, or the last book that we're going to read, The Divide, is in fact written by a PhD with a top level of expertise. And you'll find when we get there that it's not quite as easy to read as this book. So part of the reason why I chose this book is that Rutger Bregman does have some good basic grounding in his field of history, but he's primarily a sort of history journalist in the sense that he is good at telling stories. He's good at writing. He's good at putting books together that capture your imagination. But what I really like about this book is, although he's good at doing that, he also folds in a whole bunch of really important evidence from strong sources. So it's not that he is just writing this book out there with no evidence coming from experts, but in fact he is drawing from expert sources. So is he himself an expert? Not quite, but is he drawing from expert sources? Yes. Now, and another important question to ask is, which expert sources is he drawing from? And you'll note that other aspects of who he is start to tell us a story about what kinds of data he chooses to include or not. So who is he? He is a white man from the Netherlands, and he is older than you are. So you'll note over the course of the book that he's largely drawing from white, male, European, and Northern American experts. There are not a lot of other voices that are drawn into the story. So note that, right? Like that there is a connection between who he is and the way that he tells his story. So these are all important questions in thinking about how to assess and critique whatever it is you are reading as a critical thinker. Okay, moving on. Last week, we did a bunch of logical fallacies and terms related to logical fallacies that were not within the 10 Commandments. And 3 of those terms from last week that are relevant to what we're going to be discussing this week and relevant to the quiz you're about to be taking after this video are confirmation bias, availability bias, and negativity bias. So quick reminder, confirmation bias is where you are receiving lots of information, but you filter out and reject information that doesn't confirm what you want to hear. So confirmation bias is you're actively rejecting information that disconfirms your existing belief. Availability bias is a term to explain the way in which the explanation that is most readily available to us, for whatever reason in our brain, we've experienced it most recently, or it maps onto our expectations, that is the story that we are going to use to interpret what happens around us. So it doesn't necessarily have the same component that confirmation bias does, of where you're actively rejecting other information, but more it's an explanation of why you choose a particular explanation. And the reason is that it is easily available to you because of repetition or recency, or because it reflects some aspect of your own personality, is part of what we're going to get into today. And then the last term is negativity bias, and that is the tendency we all have as humans to fixate on negative information to the exclusion of positive information, negativity bias. So those are 3 reminders on terms from last week. And we have a whole bunch of new terms from the book that we're going to discuss right now. The first two, oh wait, sorry. We're going to first do examples of logical fallacies that we have discussed already from last week and apply them to what we're reading in the book for this week. So pull out your copy of the book and open up to the prologue, to page XV, which is page 15 in the prologue. And on page XV, you'll see this part right here. There is no evidence of breakdown of morale. This is the story of Lindemann during World War II. Churchill tasked him with deciding how they were going to approach breaking the morale of the Germans. And Lindemann believed, based on a theory from a philosopher, Le Bon, a Frenchman. We'll get into this whole idea of how theories impact us in a moment. But based on Le Bon's theory of human nature, that humans would, in chaos, they would start to break down and become more animalistic. Based on that theory, Lindemann figured that bombing the Germans, the civilians within Germany, to smithereens would actually break their morale. And he sent out a team of psychiatrists to test whether or not this had been true in England when the Germans had been bombing the English. So the psychiatrists compared towns that had been bombed with those that had not, to see if the morale of people, their spirits, whether or not they were ready to work and get going and fight back, whether the morale was different. And they found that in places that had been bombed, in fact, morale was higher than it was in places that had not been bombed. And they went and told that to Lindemann, that bombing doesn't work to break the morale of the people. And Lindemann ignored what they had to say, rejected it, and told Churchill, yes, the sure way to break the morale of the German people is to bomb them to smithereens. And they did. They bombed the Germans far more than the Germans ever bombed them, the English. There on that page. So what did Frederick Lindemann do with this unequivocal finding? He ignored it. So what would be the term from the terms we learned last week that we just discussed that would describe this action on Lindemann's part? Go ahead and write down what you think the answer is. I will come back to it in a minute. Think it through, write it down. Pause the video for a second too if you want. And then if you go to the next page over, going to move on, we'll come back to that in a second. If you go to the next page over, the top of the next page, thus ended the debate over the efficacy of bombing. The whole episode had, as one civil servant later described it, the perceptible smell of a witch hunt. conscientious scientists who opposed the tactic of targeting German civilians were denounced as cowards, even traitors. So this is not one of the terms that I just reminded you of, but it is a term from last week. What would this fallacy be? When you attack someone based on a slander or slur or something about their character, as opposed to engaging with debating their facts and their evidence. What's the term for that? All right, go ahead and pause while you write down your answer and then come back. All right, now moving on to page 3, planet A versus planet B. I would estimate, this is right in the middle. Now the question, what planet do we live on? I would estimate about 97% of people think we live on planet B, the planet of everyone left to fend for themselves and fighting with each other, panic breaking out, and people acting for their own good and pushing other people out of the way. 97% of people think we live on planet B. The truth is that in almost every case, we actually live on planet A. Humans don't behave in those ways in the midst of a crisis, according to all of the available data that we have. So if we have had this data, as it says a little bit later on, since World War II, we have tons of data that would say, in fact, we don't behave in this selfish and panic-stricken way in the midst of crisis, but instead we care for each other, we help each other, we come together in the midst of crisis. Why is it that people continue to believe that we do live on planet B if we actually live on planet A? And I would say that that's in fact an example of which term from last week. So once again, pause the video, think about it, write down what you think it is, and I'll come back in a second and tell you what I think it is. All right, now moving on to page 6 to 7. At the very bottom of page 6, this is Rebecca Solnit talking about Hurricane Katrina. My own impression, writes Rebecca Solnit, whose book A Paradise Built in Hell gives a masterful account of Katrina's aftermath, is that elite panic comes from powerful people who see all humanity in their own image. Dictators and despots, governors and generals, they all too often resort to brute force to prevent scenarios that exist only in their own heads, on the assumption that the average Joe is ruled by self-interest, just like they themselves are. So they themselves are a particular way, and they therefore assume that to be true of everybody else as well, and they treat everybody else in ways that they think are true based on their character. So what does that sound like to you? Pause the video, go ahead and write down what your answer is so that you can get some practice in on these terms and be sure you're learning them. Then let's see, next up, page 11. All right, right in the middle of page 11, about here. Even after researchers presented their subjects with hard data about strangers returning wallets, or the fact that the majority of the population doesn't cheat or steal, most subjects did not view humanity in a more positive light. Instead, write the psychologists, they decide that seemingly selfless behaviors must be selfish after all. Okay, so these people are presented with all of this data about people returning wallets. I've had that happen lots of times. Well, not lots of times, but recently someone returned my ATM card to me without using it, and now they've tracked me down to figure out how to get it back to me. Like, they could have just ignored it or cut it up or drained my bank account. They didn't do any of those things. They figured out who I was. They looked for me. They called me. They sent me an email. Sorry, didn't call me. They sent me an email, and I got my ATM card back like last fall. So when these facts are shared with people, they don't believe them. They reject them. So what is the term for that? Pause the video, write down your answer, and come back when you've practiced this term. Okay, last up, page 14. Let's see. The very bottom. This last paragraph on page 14. Why are we humans so susceptible to the doom and gloom of the news? 2 reasons. The first is what psychologists call negativity bias. So here it gives you the term for it. We're more attuned to the bad than to the good. Back in our hunting and gathering days, we were better off being frightened of a spider or a snake 100 times too often than 1 times too few. Too much fear wouldn't kill you, too little surely would. So the news is focused on the negative, and the reason why is because it taps into something that we humans want. Our attention is captured by the negative because that's how we are structured psychologically, evolutionarily. And so the news captures that in order to grab our attention. Anything negative is what will hook us. So it uses our negativity bias in order to gain our eyeballs. Okay, so let's go back through and I'll tell you the answers that I would choose for these various terms. So the example of Frederick Lindemann ignoring the data brought in by his psychiatrists, that would be what? Confirmation bias. The example of the conscientious scientists who objected to Frederick Lindemann bombing the German civilians unnecessarily, they were called unpatriotic, they were called cowards. That would be an example of an ad hominem fallacy or an ad hominem attack. On page 3, the example of people believing we live on planet B, even though we actually live on planet A, is availability bias, that we are told this story over and over and over again, that this is how humans are, and we believe that to be true, even though, in fact, the data don't support that. 6 to 7, the politicians who believe that everyone else is going to act in a selfish and self-serving way because that is, in fact, the nature of their own personalities. It's a form of availability bias. It's an easy explanation or an easy assumption for them. It comes to them readily because that is, in fact, how they themselves tend to be. Not all politicians, but the majority of politicians tend to be self-centered, self-serving, and very focused on self-gain in their careers. And they then assume those same things about the rest of the population, and they enact policies that treat people as if they are like they are, which is selfish and self-serving. But that is not, in fact, true of the majority of humans. So availability bias for that scenario that exists only in their head and that they use to explain everybody else. The lost wallets example, even when you tell people about people returning lost wallets or a whole host of other information that would show how good humans are, most people reject it and they find ways to think of it as selfish rather than selfless. That would be then confirmation bias. And finally, the news using our negativity bias, term was already given, negativity bias. So you can see that the terms that we have been learning are folded into this book really nicely. So we're learning some both interesting information and theories, and also learning some good critical thinking terminology to tuck into your tool belt and take with you past this class in critical thinking as you encounter logical fallacies in the world at large. All right, so those are some old terms from last week. We encountered a bunch of new terms from this week, and 2 of the primary terms that were dealt with in this chapter, but that we will see play out in the rest of the book as a whole, are the placebo effect and the nocebo effect. The placebo effect is this very real effect in medicine in which merely taking any kind of treatment has a positive impact on people who are experiencing some ailment. So the bigger and the more complicated the treatment is, then the more likely it is that it will have a strong placebo effect. So it's not that in a placebo effect, it's not that the treatment itself has any power. It's that our belief in the treatment has a power to make it, in fact, help us get better. That's a placebo effect, a positive impact that is unrelated to the thing of the treatment itself. So you could take a candy believing that it is a pill, but if you believe that that candy will in fact make your cold go away, it can have an impact on your cold. Like it can help your cold get better, even though it's candy. It's all about what you believe to be true. And you will have more belief if it is a more complicated kind of apparent treatment. So if you put people under anesthesia and you then let them wake up and you tell them that they underwent surgery, so it's this big sort of treatment, but they didn't in fact undergo surgery, they will have a better outcome than if you didn't give them any treatment at all. And sometimes, in many cases, it's just as good of an outcome on like backaches or a shoulder injury. It's just as good as an actual real surgery. So if people believe that they received some treatment and they believe in the efficacy of the treatment, the belief itself helps heal them. Such a fascinating aspect of medicine. So the reverse is also true. If you believe that something will have a negative impact on you, it will. So those children in Belgium who believe that just by having drunk some kind of Coke product or anything related to the factories in the same factories that were producing Coke products, they believed it would make them sick, and then they did get sick because they believed it. They got headaches, and they got nausea, and they got fever, and they got chills and sweats. So children, thousands of children, actually got sick, even though there was no real substance making them sick. The belief itself had a real physical impact. So why is this a useful term? These are like medical terms, right? Placebo, nocebo. This is an interesting set of terms to apply to society because it indicates the way in which the ideas in our head act as placebo effects or nocebo effects. So if we believe that people around us are selfish and greedy and dangerous, then that will make them and us more selfish and greedy and dangerous. But if we believe that the people around us are socially oriented and want to help and actually care about humans in general, that will make us all behave more in those ways. So our beliefs structure the way in which people act, and they can then have this profound impact on society at large. So changing the way in which we believe things can help change what society itself is capable of, or what becomes normal in society. So nocebo effect, if we believe that humans are greedy and selfish and dangerous, they'll behave more in that way. So let's get into that a little bit more. Those two ideas, those contrasting views of society, were originally really well coined by the European Enlightenment philosophers Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. They were writing about 100 years apart. Thomas Hobbes was an Englishman, well, a Britishman. I don't know that he was English. He might have been Welsh or potentially Scottish. I should know that. But anyway, Thomas Hobbes was writing in the UK, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau was writing 100 years after him in France. And Thomas Hobbes was writing in the 1700s. Jean-Jacques Rousseau was writing in the early 1800s. Oh, sorry, 18th century. So we have the 17th century and the 18th century, 1600s and 1700s. So Hobbes, whom Rousseau was writing against, Hobbes had this idea that humans were naturally animalistic, that we would always be selfish, always do things for our own gain, and that we would, in a state of nature, in our natural way of being, we would live in a world of vicious warfare, combat, that naturally humans were going to be dangerous to each other. And that the only way that we could make things safer for humans was to impose power from above that would control humans and make them stop being so selfish and violent towards each other, what he called a Leviathan. Rousseau, on the other hand, who's associated with the term idealism, Rousseau believed that Hobbes was entirely wrong. He believed that it wasn't that we needed society to make humans safe, but rather that humans are already naturally good and socially oriented, and it's society and the imposition of power and the imposition particularly of private property, that is, saying this property is mine and not yours, that it's that aspect of society that makes humans greedy and vicious and violent, rather than that they are naturally greedy and vicious and violent and society is needed to kind of calm them down and make them behave. So let's talk about these two terms again. So one more time on this. Thomas Hobbes' term realism, associated with realism, and this term originates with Hobbes, but it's then taken on a life of its own, and it has lots of meaning for international relations and for political theory more generally. But it started with Hobbes' basic belief that I'll read it here from the slide itself, the theory that in absence of a central authority, which Hobbes called a Leviathan, which he thought of as like the sea monster, as a term from the Bible that meant it like a sea monster. In the absence of a central authority, we're led into an anarchic state of nature where humans act out fear and self-preservation, leading to conflict without a higher power to enforce order. This version of what humans are like, this perspective, it emphasizes the importance of power, the Leviathan, the state, the government, control from society, and the necessity of a sovereign to maintain peace and order, both at the individual level and at the level of the state. So, some more explanation, having just read through that again. Realism is this idea that unless we have this strong power from outside, the state, the government, society, civilization, to impose order on us, if we don't have that, then we'll be in this chaotic, warlike, selfish state of nature. It's called realism, this idea that we have to be realistic about how selfish and potentially violent humans and states are. So this is associated with the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who talked about humans as, prior to civilization, living in a state of war of all against all. There's famous quotes of him saying that human lives were brutish, nasty, and short prior to the advent of civilization, to the power of the state, the power of government, which then controlled us. Realism. So he called it realism, but theorists since then and more recently have called it veneer theory. So this is not Hobbes's term, but this term is very much associated with Hobbes. So it's this idea that if you peel back the control of the state, the control of, say, police, the control of the government, that what happens is basically some version of many TV shows you've seen, right? Is that everyone is in the zombie apocalypse without that. Any sort of lack of an enforced power from above will put us into absolute violent chaos. So that society is a thin veneer that is layered over this seething human nature of pure evil underneath. So that whatever is good about humans is just glossing over their true inner nature, which is violent and selfish and brutish and nasty. So if you have seen I'm sure you've seen a ton of TV shows like this, but there's one in particular that has become pretty popular lately. I think, what's it called? If we were in a live class, you'd all tell me what the name of the show is. But anyway, yeah, those are like all versions of veneer theory, this idea that Hobbes gave us with realism. All right, so moving on to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, his term idealism. He thought that Hobbes was crazy. He thought that that was just, in fact, the opposite of what was true looking back over, particularly contrasting the way European society was with the way in which indigenous Native American people were, that were then being, starting to be encountered and written about, that he looked at the ways that their societies were very harmonious, even though they didn't have strong governmental structures forcing people to be good, but they lived in ways that seemed more civilized, more democratic, more egalitarian than European society, without the necessity for prisons and for as extreme forms of warfare as were true in Europe. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, looking at data coming out of indigenous people in the Americas, created a theory that spoke to the idea of the inherent goodness of man and the corrupting influences of society. So he said, in fact, previously in a state of nature, we were harmonious, we were healthy, we got a lot more exercise, we had a lot more access to good food supplies, various food supplies that all of that made us better than we are in this crippled form of civilization that we think of as being a step up, but in fact is not a step up. And he thought that social conflict and political and particularly economic inequality were created by society, were created by initially the very first time a human drew a line around a piece of land and said, this is my land. You can't come here. This is my private property. Stay off, which was never the way that humans used to think of or interact with the land and with the resources. They were always shared previously. As soon as we cordoned something off and said, this is mine, and we created laws about you can't come here, and we started to have civilization in that way, that it's then that we started to devolve into higher forms of warfare, higher forms of violence against each other, and we created all sorts of other kinds of problems. It's through that initial establishment of private property that brought us society, and that society brought us the worst version of humanity, and that we were way better off without that. So these two sets of ideas, Hobbes and Rousseau, realism versus idealism, I want you to keep them in mind over the course of the whole rest of this book and into the next book, and think about which of these two theories ultimately has better evidence for it. Because neither of these two theorists, these philosophers, were using much in the way of theory. They were just sort of talking out of their heads rather than having grounded evidence. If either of them had actual evidence, it was a little bit more Rousseau, who was drawing evidence from Native Americans, but neither of them were really invested in evidence. They were just talking about theory. So I want you to see, as a critical thinker, which of these two ideas seems to be closer to the existing body of evidence about what humans and human society have been like over the course of human history. On that note, chapter 2, which you are not reading this week, you're reading the prologue, chapter 1, and you're reading part 1 and chapter 3. Chapter 2, which I have not assigned you, actually puts up an experiment along these lines. So if you've read the book, The Lord of the Flies, in high school, it's a very famous book by William Golding, William Golding, which was so popular, and it circulated through our shared mythos so much that we all have this general idea. The story drops a group of boys from a private boarding school from England, drops them onto a isolated island and leaves them there for a long period of time, over a year. And it's the story of what happens to them. And Golding had this idea, a Hobbesian idea, that we were naturally brutish, naturally sort of savage. And he tells the story of these civilized British boys devolving into these brutish, very violent, and very scary versions of themselves, because there's no more society to make them behave. Well, so that's this fictional version of what humans are like. Interestingly enough, there was a real world example of exactly this. There were 6 boys from a English-speaking boarding school in Samoa who got a boat, and they borrowed a boat, and they got stranded on a tropical island, and they were left there by themselves, no way to get off of it, and a tiny island in the huge ocean that hardly anyone ever went by. They were there for 18 months, so a year and a half, just them by themselves. They were from the ages of 12 until ages of 15. So not very, the picture of them below was later, after they had been saved. And during that time on the island, they could have become, if the Lord of the Flies were true, they could have become this little group of savages out to get each other and warring with each other, as happened in the Lord of the Flies. But in reality, the exact opposite happened. They worked really hard to stay harmonious with each other. They worked really hard to end any kind of disputes, and they built what they needed. They had a constant smoke signal going up in case any boats came by. They had a very structured way of keeping themselves alive. They even found ways to set a broken leg and take care of each other. So they really banded together. They were very carefully coordinating their efforts to both stay alive and to get help. And they were saved 18 months later. And it was the exact opposite of what the fictional version, that is the story that we all know about, their story showed the goodness of human nature in a crisis, the goodness of these boys' nature, and their capacity to truly pull together. Whereas Lord of the Flies had them pitted against each other, like killing each other. And so the story that we tell ourselves, so what's available to us, like Lord of the Flies, is truly the opposite of what is factually accurate about us. Super interesting contrast there. All right, so Bregman tells you in this chapter that you should avoid the news because it is a source of negativity bias. And I wanted you to stop and think about that for a bit. I think probably a lot of us feel this way because staying up on top of the news can feel really depressing, and it can feel like something that is dangerous to our mental health. I know lots of people, including me, feel this way. And so Bregman says, you know what, I've just stopped reading the news, and instead I read a good book and to inform myself. So I want you to ask yourself, at the point that you are at right now in your life, whether that is good advice for you. I think that for the audience Bregman's writing for, which is largely for educated Europeans and older people here in the United States, I think it's not terrible advice for people who already kind of have a good sense of the basics of the world. But I think for you, for most students in college who are new to the world in many ways and potentially did not grow up in a household that had high quality news sources, and so you're not fully aware of all the things you should possibly know about how the world works, I don't think it's the best advice. I do think that it is good advice to have high quality sources of news, to not get too caught up on the daily breaking news. That stuff can get very kind of mind numbing, but instead to be generally aware of what's happening in the world, important information especially, and to be constantly adding to your sense of what the world contains through the news. I think that's actually, as a critical thinker, a pretty important thing to be doing right now in this age that you're in your student era. I think this is a good thing to be doing. So to that end, we're going to talk about this a lot more later in the semester, but to that end, I want you to start thinking about what you're using for your news sources right now. And I would suggest to you that you potentially consider reading the news from a newspaper rather than watching the news on television. Especially don't watch the news on cable television. So we'll get more into this later, but I suggest starting to read one of these newspapers, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post or the Guardian or the LA Times. Consider a newspaper. That's one. Even more so, I would suggest that you consider getting your news from radios and podcasts that are high quality and that are vetted. So National Public Radio, if you turn on your radio in your car to 89.3 in this area or 89.5 in that range, there's two different NPR stations, and get the news from National Public Radio. That can be highly informative and very professionally delivered and not super catastrophizing and attention-grabbing version of the news. Even better for podcasts, just to be able to like listen to them while you're when you want to, rather than when it's playing on the radio. NPR News Now will keep you updated on breaking news. That's if you want breaking news. The podcast, The Daily from the New York Times, it takes one news story and it goes into it in depth. And it does it in about anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes. The reason I think this is such a good way to get your news is that if you listen to it on a daily basis, you're going to get the top general stories for the week, but you're going to get a much more nuanced, in-depth version of those stories than the headline and breaking kinds of news that you're going to get from TV or even from reading the headlines in a newspaper. So I think it's a much more responsible way to stay informed. Only get a little bit, only get the most important things, and get an in-depth version of it. So the Daily, I think, from the New York Times which is free, I think is an excellent way to do that. Consider This from NPR also is somewhat similar, and Today Explained from Vox is also somewhat similar. One story, in depth, thinking about trying to get away from the headlines and trying to get into the complexity of the story. So I would like you to start folding in high quality news sources into your daily life to get to be more informed as a critical thinker, because it's absolutely necessary to knowing what's true in the world and knowing how you should act, how you should vote, how you should behave in the world is all. You have to have a high quality stream of information to be able to do that. So we'll get into this more later, as I said. So at the very end of this chapter, Bregman goes into this very interesting bit about how much better the world is than we think, and that things are constantly getting better, that humans are living longer, that there's less violence, and that there's less poverty than there used to be. And I want to note that he's largely drawing this from a psychologist at Harvard called Steven Pinker, who wrote a book called The Better Angel of Our Nature, which is going to come up, the same exact title is going to come up in the book later again. And Steven Pinker wrote this, we're going to talk about this later on, he wrote this without necessarily being an expert in the fields that he was trying to assess, which are basically archaeology and anthropology, my fields more. And his data are suspect. So although I think Bregman makes a good case in this book that human nature is not what we think it is, and that humans are naturally socially oriented and not self-centeredly oriented or selfishly oriented. I think he does make a good case for that. I think you'll find that he doesn't make a good case for the idea that things are getting better all the time, especially in terms of poverty. We're going to get into that a lot more later in the semester, and especially with the book The Divide, which really takes a critical crack at that idea that we're just getting better and better, and shows you with real data what's true about that. So I want you to note that Bregman does pull in, I think, high quality information, and sometimes he also pulls in some ideas that are not entirely true. He himself acknowledges that later in the book, and we'll get to there again, but hold on to this idea that, okay, so he's talking about things getting better, but he doesn't necessarily offer great evidence of that. Is it true or not? And I think we'll find out that there's reason to be critical of this idea that he shares as if it were true later on in the semester. So that is it for the prologue and chapter 1. Go ahead now and take the quiz. When you take the quiz, there are a combination, it'll say this in the instructions, there is a combination of both fill in the blank and multiple choice. The fill in the blank questions you need to carefully type so that you are getting it correct and you're not misspelling anything, because if you misspell it, unfortunately, it will mark it wrong, and there's only one go at the quiz. So I hope this video was helpful, and I hope to see some of you in office hours this week. You have about this chapter. I'm happy to answer for you. You can read the chapters, watch the videos, then come to discussion and discuss them with me before you take the quiz. I think that's the smartest way to do things. So hope to see you, and see you again in a minute for video 2 on chapter 3.